believe we're live. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining to another great show today. And I have the one and only, Brian Berletic from the New Atlas, and I have my dear friend Alex with me as well. We have a
Hi there.
great show lined up for you guys. You guys are very lucky. You're going to have some amazing topics to talk about. First of all, Brian, how are you? And I'll come on to Alex after that. How you been?
I'm doing very well. I'm anxious to hear from you how the weather is there in the UK, and then also from Alex where he is and where he's sporting a nice, cozy virtual fireplace there.
I'll leave mine to the end. So Alex, how's the weather in Chongqing and how's life in Chongqing for you?
Uh, well, we're opening up with caution, and weather is getting chilly here now. But we're preparing for this big opening of China.
In UK, I can tell you from first hand, my missus couldn't get to work today because her car has completely frozen over, and she just could not get into the car. She could not even if she melted the ice with hot water, the car just wouldn't start. It's that cold. We've had some Arctic weathers since yesterday, minus 10 degrees in some areas in
Mm.
UK, and all hell is breaking loose, guys. There's nurses, ambulance drivers, everyone's striking at the worst possible time. People are dying because they can't call the ambulance. Obviously, the strike hasn't happened yet, but there's no beds in the NHS. People are panicking. People are running around. Nobody's going to work. It's all mayhem at the moment. Sunak's under a lot of pressure. He's in hiding at the
Mm.
moment. There's people having power cuts as well. It's all going crazy. The media here has been ordered to keep things quiet because they do not want to incite any riots in UK at the moment. So things are very quiet on the media side. They're trying to talk about other subjects around the world, but I can tell you from the ground, people outside are literally panicking right now. It's going to get worse over the next few days and few weeks, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So we're here for a couple of talking points today. I want to first of all start with what's happening in Ukraine, and we have a major story how a couple of drones, I think there was three drones in particular, went very deep into Russian territory, and we're talking very, very deep, almost as far as Moscow even. I mean, if they can go that deep, they can easily strike Moscow. So there's been three drones which went very deep and hit some airfields in Russia, and there's a couple of explosions which have been released. Russia says that these drones have been shot down and then they exploded on the ground afterwards. I'm not 100% sure how that would work, but what do you think, Brian? I mean, first of all, what the hell happened to Russia's air defense systems? I mean, their defense systems are supposed to be the best in the world. S-400s, S-500s, and you would think that they would literally cover that border area between Ukraine and Russia with loads of air defenses, nothing we can get through. And the other question is, do you think this was some sort of test by NATO? They're just testing the waters and see how far they can get with drones and what they can do and what they can get away with. I mean, is this something? It sounds very suspicious to me. What's your thoughts about this?
Well, the whole thing on the West and the Ukrainian side is very suspicious. As far as Russia goes, this is something that happens across many militaries and also Russia. Uh, Famously, complacency. I think is the human factor. They were not paying attention. They probably never thought this was going to happen, and they were taken by surprise. I highly doubt that they're not going to revise how they have their air defenses set up, their readiness. I think they're going to review all of that. It was the same with Sevastopol in Crimea. That was attacked. Now it's attacked regularly, but these attacks do nothing. But in the beginning, they got some lucky shots in, and it was because, again, complacency. So this is something that Russia is kind of known for historically. complacency, but then they get their act together. Either way, when we're just looking at these attacks themselves, this was supposed to be a preemptive strike against this wave of missiles that we were all told Russia was getting ready to launch. And then they did launch it, regardless of these 2 or 3 drones, old Soviet-era Tupolev jet drones. They did minimum damage. It is shocking that they got that far. And it was the air defenses at these airfields that would have shot them down, because there was damage done at least at one airfield. Russia says it's minimum. The evidence that I see coming from the West trying to suggest that, aspects of this attack seem to also suggest it was just a little bit of damage at one airfield. There were some fatalities. I think Russia has even admitted that as well. So losing personnel, that is very bad.
Yep.
The equipment, you'd rather that have been damaged instead, but instead it was minimally damaged. Now, what I thought was strange about all of this was how the Western media was talking about, well, we have satellite images of these aircraft getting ready on the tarmac. They're getting ready. We know. And I don't remember the Western media doing this previously regarding these missile attacks. I don't remember them making such a big deal about it. And I think the reason they might have done that was they were passing this information to Ukraine. They knew Ukraine was going to do this. They were getting ready to do this. This isn't something you plan to do overnight. They were passing the intelligence to them. And for plausible deniability, they were publicly reporting that Russian warplanes were getting ready to launch these missile strikes. So they could say, wow, no, they just were watching the news. That's all. We didn't pass them any. They did this all on their own, which doesn't actually work, because without U.S. and NATO support, nothing Ukraine is doing right now would be possible. So that the U.S. and NATO are responsible for absolutely everything Ukraine does from 2014 onward, because this is a regime, a military, a political system that would not exist without constant support. And now more than ever, because Ukraine has no economy, their military is on life support from the West and clinging to life. And so these are all important factors to keep in mind looking at this situation. That said, this is not something they're going to be able to, expand out. And this is not something that made any difference. The missile strikes went as planned. They created, again, another wave of significant damage on multiple types of targets, and they're going to continue doing this. So the attack was, like always, for PR points, and very temporary PR points, because now Russia has justification to retaliate and go beyond, escalate beyond what it has been doing up until now.
And Alex, what's your thoughts on this? And you're quite experienced with drone warfare and drones in particular. Do you think, one of the questions I have is, do you think military drones can fly that far? Because we're talking about huge distances here, thousands of kilometers. What's your thoughts about all of this?
Well, let me bring up a diagram here of what we're talking about here. We're talking about the Tupolev Tu-141. Okay, and it's very easy to have a look at this. And this drone is specifically, I call it a one-liner, okay, because it pretty much can only go in one line. And if you see, if we just kind of zoom in there, I don't know if you guys can see this now.
That's nice, Alex.
If we go to the, oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I just want to bring up here, if we get closer to the bottom, you can see just on the far, I guess that's going to be left or right of the screen there, you'll see that is where this drone is pretty much equipped just to use, it's not built to bomb people. It's built for pretty much a reconnaissance mission. And I guess if they wanted to do a suicide assault weapon of this kind of, drone, they could. Now, that's exactly what I think has happened here.
Yep.
And as Brian has said, the Ukrainian aircraft and the Ukrainian in the skies, I mean, they are pretty much, they can't control anything, let alone, I mean, their own. Now, I'm going to give you some history on this. Okay, guys, a little bit of history here. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, but when the special operations was happening from Russia, the Ukrainians put these things in the air. In fact, on the 10th of March, This exact drone, the Tu-141, crashed in the front of the student campus in Zagreb in Croatia. Okay. It was over 550 kilometers from Ukraine before it crashed. It had flown over Romania and Hungary undetected as well. Okay. The Russian embassy in Zagreb stated that the Russian forces had not had such drones in their arsenal since the collapse of 91. Now, this should really kind of add to the story that happened in Poland a few weeks back, that these guys can't keep control of their own garbage. Okay. Second of all, is that when the blame game goes on, especially to Russia, well, this very instance here, it was after the investigation was taken that it was found that it was 1 to 2 drones had gone astray on the Ukraine army again. And once again, this is something that always happens where when they're using such old, or I would say such old drones like this. I mean, we're talking 70s, early, I would say very late 70s technology here. Pretty much only used for a reconnaissance mission. They probably strapped a little bit of explosives to it. It was a suicide mission. 1 line, 1 frame, 1,000. These things can do about 1,000 top speed, and they can pretty much only go 1 line. And I'm not sure why the media is not talking about what happened on the 10th of March with this exact style of drone in Hungary. I mean, these things, it's right here. Croatian President Zoran Milanovic said it was clear that the drone came from the direction of Ukraine after flying over Hungary. On the 15th, an undisclosed source close to the Ministry of Defense of Croatia was cited in the Croatian news magazine. I mean, this has all been just kind of washed out of the internet, kind of really deep down, and it's really disturbing. Now, what I'm gonna kind of go on record here and say that if they're starting to put these, and this is really going to back up Brian's research, because Brian, you do fantastic research, by the way. This proves that they are scraping the bottom of the barrels when they're putting 70s technology up in the air, and they brought it back in 2014. This isn't used by the Russians anymore. And this kind of stuff here is just, it's got desperation written all over it. Back to you, AJ.
Yeah, I think the question on everyone's mind is, even though these are 70s technology, I mean, it's still managed to fly thousands of miles into Russian territory. So that is kind of scary. And I think people's questions are, if they can fly that far, they can easily fly to Moscow. And what if there's newer versions of this? Then they can probably even fly even further. What's your thoughts on this, Brian? What's your take?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, and a lot of people have brought that up. I was listening to the Duran talking about this today, and what if these were more modern weapon systems, NATO weapon systems? What if NATO launched a very large coordinated cruise missile strike on targets all across Russia? What would their air defense system do? And so this is a wake-up call for Russia to rethink the way they're doing things right now. If there is complacency among their forces who are supposed to be defending Russian airspace, this needs to be rectified. You would hope that air defense is denser around Moscow and in better shape in terms of readiness. But these air bases were significant air bases. There are nuclear weapons supposedly stored at these, and this is their strategic bombers that they've been using and are key for this operation and other operations that they've been involved in recent years. The United States really, I mean, when you look at their strategic bombers, they're also just out on the runway. But as I pointed out before, you have 2 oceans between you and everyone else. You don't really necessarily have to worry about that. Russia should worry about that, because everyone to the west of them is hostile toward them and are feeding into this proxy war. And the whole reason Russia is in Ukraine in the first place is not just because Ukraine, but the implications of NATO militarizing Ukraine and building it up as a national security threat right on their border. So hopefully, like in other instances, this is something that will be rectified very quickly. As Alex pointed out, and I agree with him, this is desperation. three of these, and then the missile strikes, the Russian missile strikes went on as planned anyway. So what was achieved, and what will be achieved by continuously doing this? And this is something, as Alex pointed out, it's flying in a straight line. They're going to be looking for them now. It's not something that is, again, like everything else Ukraine does, it's not something that's going to turn the tide. It's very, very short PR points. And then actually in the intermediate and long term, Russia is going to retaliate. And then the suffering for the people across Ukraine will increase because of this, specifically because of this.
Okay, so this leads me to the next question. How will Russia rectify this? And I for one, I was looking at different ways, and one of the ways is, with drones, it's a bit difficult to shoot them down. Do you want to shoot them down with your S-400 missiles or S-500 missiles? Because if these are 1970s, these are very old missiles, very cheap. And if you shoot them down with your missiles, economically you are losing, because if these missiles cost more than the drones, then you are losing, and you're giving away your position as well. So I'm sure NATO would have loved to know where these S-400, S-500 batteries are located. So that would give away your position. The only two countries I know of who shoot down drones with lasers is China and Turkey. I don't think Russia has got anything like that, but another way they can rectify it is Russia could take over Kharkiv, for example, and take over the whole eastern border of Ukraine up to the river. And I believe that was the original plan anyway, because that would basically cover their borders. That would mean that Ukraine would have to fly further into Russian territory, further through Ukraine, and then into Russia. That could be another way. What do you think? How would they kind of rectify this and fix these issues? And what do you think about my suggestions as well?
Yeah. I think it's the human factor. I think is the main reason. The fact that it got so close would suggest that it wasn't S-400 or S-500 or even S-300 that shot it down. It was one of the shorter or intermediate range systems that Russia has that do point defense around facilities. Seems to be what shot it down. They're going to look at what happened and why, despite shooting it down, this debris still rained onto the airfield. Maybe they'll adjust those defenses. And again, overall, they're going to rethink their whole air defense readiness and strategy. Pushing further into Ukraine, I mean, that is the whole point of the special military operation ultimately. Maybe not right now, but ultimately it is to create a buffer between them and the rest of NATO, and also these forces that NATO is backing to carry out attacks like this. And I just want to reiterate again, Sevastopol, the naval base in Crimea. This has been repeatedly attacked now, and in the beginning there were some initial successes because, again, complacency. They thought they were far enough away. It wasn't really going to happen. When it did happen, they beefed up security, improved readiness, and now they're able to cope with these attacks and these. Again, it's rendered Ukraine's efforts to carry out these sort of long-range strikes. It's rendered them moot more or less, and it's thrashing, essentially. Thrashing by Ukraine, desperately trying to strike back as its infrastructure is dismantled week by week.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Over to you, Alex. I did love that 3D figure of that drone that you made. Initially made me remind me of Star Wars, the TIE fighters. And Star Wars was made in the 1970s as well. What do you think, Alex? Are we looking at a lot of pain for the Ukrainians now? I mean, Russia's probably got more reason to push into Ukraine and take more territory now and build that buffer zone. What's your thoughts?
I mean, in these types of zones, there is always hardship, and anybody that's still there or in some of these major cities has to really think about the next 30 to 60 days, where they want to be. I know it's disheartening to actually leave your home or your family or your relatives behind, but this is part of strategy. This is part of war strategy. It's gone on in the Second World War, the First World War. that winter is coming. We have that saying for a reason, because it's true. Human and Mother Nature really play games with each other here. And here's where it's going to get difficult. As the temperatures continue to drop, I think Russia has been quite polite on its hints of they're going to ramp it up. Now, if you've taken out 30, 40, let's call it even 50% of the power grids all throughout Ukraine, you know, the writing should be on the wall there. What's next after power grids? Could it be rail lines? Could it be, you know, underground cabling? Could it be, you know, gas lines underground where, you know, all you have to do is drop a few major bombs in the middle, or even some of the oil or some of the gas plants that are supplying the gas and heating. Let me give you guys an example. When the Soviet Union collapsed, most of these countries, the Baltics, they stayed on a similar heating system. And the heating system would be even generated by the government today, even in the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and even Poland, Czech. What happens is most homes there are heated by gas. And they have some of them in the old towns, you'll see them, they have the old radiators. Well, that heat usually doesn't get turned on by the government until it hits a certain level, or it drops to a certain level over the wintertime. Well, I'm sure it's already on already. Now, what happens is that these lines, they pump in the heating. So most people aren't prepared for electrical heating, let alone wanting to bear the cost of that. So the government has usually provided that for years. And this is actually one of the things that really invigorated people to hit the streets in 2004. They used the rising costs, where Russia and Ukraine said, yeah, you know, the electricity costs are going to have to go up. But the European Union was promising other better things ahead for them. Well, you know, if you have a choice of either eating or heating, it's going to be pretty difficult for you over the next few weeks here. Now, I think, as Brian has, you know, categorically shown in his videos for the last few months here, it's a system. It's systematically taking out these power grids. It's a slow grind, and they could very easily move course. They could be hitting some of these, you know, gas lines underneath the ground. They have the technology and the bombs to do that. Well, you start taking out these gas lines. Well, there goes the gas. Okay. The electricity's out. Well, then you got some serious problems here. And this is where I will call it the support for the guy in Kiev, I think, will drastically change when the heating's gone and you can't even cook food. Sorry, but he's on a clock that's running out of time fast. That's my 2 cents.
That's right. And even though Britain right now is very cold, and we're talking about minus 10 degrees, but Ukraine is probably even more colder, because Ukraine is in a part of the world which is almost, you know, it's probably one of the coldest regions on Earth, apart from Russia. And you know, the problem with Ukraine is a lot of the youngsters who have actually managed to move onto the borders and gone into other European countries as refugees. A lot of the old people tended to stay behind in Ukraine, mainly because they couldn't or they don't want to. And they are at risk, aren't they? Because if there's not much electricity or gas or even water, how can they survive these winter conditions? I mean, over to you, Brian.
Oh, that's a good question, and I really don't know. I think that's something that I would want to ask Gonzalo Lira. He's in Kharkov. I'd probably ask him how he, in his opinion, people are going to cope, you know, through these different scenarios. I think electricity being out, just on its own, not even talking about heating, that alone is going to be very disruptive. Gonzalo has talked about these high-rise apartments. These you know you see them in the footage in these different city centers. Those need electric pumps to pump water up. They need elevators. You're not walking up 20 floors. Nobody's doing that. And so this is what the people in Ukraine are faced with. And as Alex has said, Russia is not doing this by surprise. They have incrementally escalated. People have had plenty of time to, the weather, pretty cold. and people have had plenty of time to prepare themselves one way or the other. Are you going to stay? Or are you going to leave? When even the Ukrainian government is telling people to leave, suggesting to them to leave, hinting at the possibility of evacuating cities because they have no way to run them. I mean, this is catastrophic. This is what subordinating yourself to the United States and NATO does. This is the game plan. Over and over again, we've seen one opposition group positioned into power after the other, and one nation after the other, and these nations being destroyed. Ukraine is not the exception. It is also going to be destroyed, and we're watching it happen right now. And I've always said, you know, people blame Russia. NATO deliberately created a national security threat on Russia's border. They did it because they knew Russia would have to react. They articulated this in their policy papers, extending Russia by the Rand Corporation. They talked about how, you know, it could potentially blow up in their face if Russia decided to actually go full in and invade Ukraine, which now they have. And now it's blowing up in their face. This could be stopped at any time by NATO, Ukraine's backers, the US and NATO. At any time they could say, all right, this was a bad idea. Oops, we've done it again to another country. Let's stop before there's nothing left, like we've done to every other country. But they're not going to do that. So it's unfortunate that we have to watch and how predictable this is all going to be as it plays out.
As people, you know, you've seen what the US has done to other countries, and namely Iraq, Afghanistan, the way US has been using all these proxies to fight their wars, and they turned their backs on them when it depends on their own interests. And throughout history, US has always done that. They always like to kind of use these proxies, and then they kind of turn their backs and stab them in the back. And we're talking about people like Saddam, even, which was the US's friend, and look how he ended up. Do people not look at history when they kind of follow the US into these proxy wars? And history seems to be repeating itself over and over and over again. I mean, what are these people thinking? And it's not just Ukrainians now. People in Taiwan are almost, you know, there are people in Taiwan who are very much pro-Western, pro-US, and you know, it keeps happening over and over. What's your thoughts, Alex? What goes through the mind process of these people?
Well, I mean, we have to look at this from a business standpoint, to be honest here. You saw the chaperones of salesmen go to Taiwan a few months ago with Nancy Pelosi. And this is on both sides here. We have this on the Democrats and we have this on the Republican side. I mean, Lindsey Graham is a great pusher of artillery to Taiwan. We did see an interesting election here, voting a few weeks back, and the Taiwanese won none of this. They don't want any of this. Enough that Taiwan's leader will eventually resign and step down. This to me, once again, is America will have to look for another country to sell its arms to. It's done great. I know I don't want to say that with enthusiasm, but wow, have they managed to sucker a lot of countries into replenishing the NATO compliant countries. Remember, when you become part of NATO, I believe it's almost 2% of your GDP has to go to purchasing and becoming NATO compliant. Well, we have 2 new members, Sweden and Finland have joined the club. So we see a big bump up of old artillery maybe sent to the new guys, and the old guys that had the old stuff, it gets replenished. So the war machine is ramped up in full capacity. But the sad point here is in Ukraine, think about this for a moment. The country is actually destroying itself from within. It's not just the Russian side that's bombing it. Got to remember, Ukraine is using NATO artillery to fire on what used to be part of their territory and what they rightfully say in many occasions that they want back. Zelensky has said, under no circumstances are we ever going to give in. We want everything back, including Crimea. Well, if you want the Donbass region back, boy, oh boy, you have a funny way of showing it, because you have absolutely obliterated that place from the outside in. And it's incredible, the amount of artillery that's going back and forth, the buildings, the infrastructure. I actually don't believe we're ever going to see Ukraine even remotely close to what it was a few years back. When all this is said and done, when NATO gets their part, where Russia agrees on that part, where I hope this guy will enter into, an agreement to stop this nonsense. I don't know how many young soldiers between the ages of 20 or 25, or even young men, are going to be left in that country. He has categorically wiped out a generation of his youth. It's sad, and it's almost, and I'm going to say this, it's almost selfish, because when your back corner, and just look at the maps over the last 100 years, they've been rewritten. Geography has been rewritten. Borders have been, fought over. It's part of history. Hasn't this guy learned that, 100,000 or so potential deaths on his side, and the infrastructure that has been obliterated? Isn't it enough to put his pride to the side, sit down, and try to keep what's left of that country? Because the way he's going about it, and don't get me wrong, I don't condone war at any time, but this is a bloody fight against, it's Russia not really fighting him much anymore, but this has to come from Washington. Somebody in Washington has to say, okay, we got to end this. That's my take on it.
If I could just kind of expand on what Alex was talking about, the way the U.S. sets up a client state is by picking people who are unable to see what they are actually doing, and instead believe they're doing something completely different. Vladimir Zelensky thinks he is a hero, a savior, a rock star, a superstar of one type or another. He believes this. He believes he's doing something great. He has all of these awards showered upon him to not just build up his image across the public, the Western public especially, but in his own mind, his ego, build up his ego. It makes it impossible for people like this to reconcile what's actually happening with what they think is happening, or what they wish was happening. And it happens over and over again. These are people who are deliberately put into power because they are unable to act in the interests of themselves and their people. They are predictable. They have starving egos that only the US is able to feed to the level they demand. And this is what creates these self-destructive client regimes that have over and over again run millions of people into the ground. This is just the latest example. And I think Alex is right. This isn't going to stop until the US, NATO stop it. And at any point they could pull the plug and it would stop, because Ukraine is not fighting this anymore. This is US and NATO money and weapons, and increasingly fighters infiltrating in. I just saw a video of these foreign fighters retreating because they came up against a T-90 tank, and they're using small arms and anti-tank weapons, which are not as capable as are being sold by the Western media, and they had to retreat. And I think this is an illustration of the futility of this whole conflict. No matter how well Ukrainian troops are trained, and they're not being trained very well, to be honest, it doesn't matter, because they don't have artillery, they don't have armor, they don't have air power. So how are you gonna win a war against someone who does? You're not. Period.
That's right. I think I was trying to lean towards more about the people of Ukraine. I mean, I don't see any mass demonstrations. From what I can see, a lot of the Ukrainians, probably 80-90% of them, still are in support of Zelensky and in support of this war. And a lot of them took part in the color revolution in the Maidan as well. And
can I add to that, AJ?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, when you're saying that people aren't out on the streets, I mean, first of all, most NGOs are scared as hell, and they have left. They've packed up their bags as soon as they saw all hell would break loose. We'll talk at on the ground little soldier NGOs that kind of orchestrated the Maidan movement. Remember, this takes a fair amount of money. If you go back and you look at the footage from the Maidan and the 2004, all these revolutions, they're massively funded. You're not holding up $150 placard saying, end this or start this. These are coming out of great print shops. It costs a lot of money. Somebody managed to keep the whole center of the Kiev well fed for thousands of people that went for months on months. So we're seeing I would say partially, not all, but a lot of the NGOs have either the ones that are on the ground troops that ramp up, pay, get people into this, have pretty much vacated the premises and maybe planning flight tickets to another country, possibly in Asia, or maybe they've even ramped up their exposure in Thailand. I remember when I was in Thailand, and Brian, you have nailed this one to the T. The NGOs in Thailand are absolutely, they're everywhere. And it's quite scary on what they can do when they're fully funded. And that's why I think, you're not seeing that in the Ukraine right now because, they've either vacated or left. And I would just want to add to this before I hand it back to you, AJ, is a lot of the money has left too. We've seen 3 crypto billionaires in the last 30 days die, who are owners of crypto companies. Some of them have ties to the Ukrainian government. One died in the Principality of Monaco, where I used to live for almost 20 years. Monaco is not a big place, 35,000 people, 29,000 residents, and 6,000 monogas. Helicopter crash with a perfectly good blue sky day into the side of a hill in Villefranche with connections to a Ukraine funded charity. 1 in 8 cars pretty much flying up and down the Principality of Monaco. And just to let you know, Monaco is a tax haven. It's sandwiched in between the Italy and France. And it's very easy for Ukrainians to go there. A lot have. There's been an investigative report by a newspaper called Pravda that exposed the Ukrainian billionaires and millionaires that went there. 1 in 8 cars are showing a Ukraine license plate. Their yachts are there now. There's billions and billions of dollars being funneled through this area. And as a matter of fact, the people that were doing the investigation at the Pravda newspaper, well, the Ukraine government decided to do an investigation on the reporters as well. So money is leaking all over the place. They call it the Monaco Battalion. The Monaco Battalion, you guys can just look it up. You can see it. It's all about a lot of the oligarchs from Ukraine, moving in there. And I'll tell you, that place, it's a great place to be. But sometimes there are people that really take that place for a ride. And right now, all that money that's coming from the West, some of it is squeaking out, and definitely it's sitting in Monaco right now. It's a principality, and if you don't, want to just rely on what I'm saying there, just fire up the computer, look up the Panama or the Pandora Papers, either or, and type in the president of Ukraine and see how many offshore companies in the British Virgin Islands pop up with him connected to. You'd be quite surprised. Thanks.
Exactly,
If I could, because Alex brings up a lot of good points. I agree with him, and I think that there are 2 reasons why you don't see the Ukrainian people rising up. Number one, just like Alex said, any protest, any large-scale protest that has any chance of making any difference requires organization and money, even if it's for a good purpose. I saw one unfold between 2013 and 2014 here in Thailand, and it was kind of a reverse color revolution. It was Thai people and Thai interests trying to oust a U.S. client regime, and it was successful, but it had major backing. This would not have happened by just people spontaneously coming out onto the streets. That just does not happen. And the second reason, and I think Alex kind of touched on it when he was talking about these journalists being investigated, they're gonna kill you. They're gonna arrest you, jail you, or kill you. And they have been killing people. They've been killing all kinds of people. You have literal Nazis in the Ukrainian military, paramilitary, local law enforcement, SBU. they will kill you if you're talking about these things or making a nuisance of yourself or protesting. It would be seen as unpatriotic. We know how psychotic, say, even the U.S. got during the so-called war on terror, and that was for something that was happening thousands of miles away. Imagine how bad it is in Ukraine right now, considering all these factors that we're talking about.
And you're right. And we have Baki L, who has said that Ukraine has literally filtered, they killed or silenced every single person who has remotely opposed this war. And I guess you're right. People in Ukraine are scared. There's not much they can do. There's no money. There's no electricity. There's probably no internet. So for them to organize something like that would be almost impossible. They're probably all, stuck in their homes, not knowing what to do, scared,
trying to survive.
Trying to survive, exactly. And as you know, it's very, very cold right now. So they're doing everything they can do to survive. And the people who are running this war, the Zelenskys, the PR agents, the West, they're doing a fine job. I mean, even the West, people in Britain even, are completely oblivious to what's happening in Ukraine. Yeah, absolutely oblivious. People have been absolutely brainwashed here in UK and probably most of Europe. But there are obviously there are small elements of people who are clued up, who know what's happening around the world. But we're talking very small and few and far in between. And I remember in the Iraq War, there was 32 million people marching in the streets, and we have nothing in those numbers, absolutely nothing. I want to go back to talking about the drone incident. Actually, initially when these explosions happened in Russia, there was articles talking about HIMARS, and it kind of made sense at the time when I read it. And obviously the Russians said it was drones afterwards, but initially they thought it was HIMARS that did it. And I also read an article in the Washington Post, and they said that the US has sent HIMARS to Ukraine, and what they've done, these are long-range HIMARS, but what they've done, they've coded it so it doesn't go further beyond a certain distance or something like that. So they did some hard code inside these HIMARS. And my question is, if these are hard coded, if these are long range HIMARS and these are hard coded to be short range HIMARS, and they are in Ukraine, and everybody knows that if you're a good hacker, you can easily hack into these systems and turn it into a long range one. Is that something that could be possible, Brian? Is that something that can be done?
Well, even if it was a foolproof way that they've safed them against using these longer range ATACMS missiles, Germany, the UK, they've sent M270s, which are a tracked version of the HIMARS. It has 2 rocket pods instead of 1, and they could easily fire ATACMS. So I've heard, again, from the Duran, a very interesting conversation about why the U.S. announced this. A couple of ideas. One, they're trying to, again, plausible deniability regarding any involvement with these long-range attacks deep in Russia. Also, maybe there is different factions in the Pentagon and in Washington and in the State Department. Some people want to give Ukraine longer-range weapons, others do not. And so maybe someone said, let's safe the HIMARS from firing longer-range ATACMS, and then we don't have to worry about it. That even if you send the missile and try to use it with the HIMARS, it won't work. But again, Germany and the UK and others have sent the M270, which is perfectly capable of firing long-range ATACMS, and I highly doubt that they would have safed those as well. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because the ATACMS is available in fewer numbers than even these HIMARS rockets that have been sent to Ukraine that they're already running out of. It's something that Russia has as well, but in greater quantities, the Iskander missile system, which is actually more capable than ATACMS. And so if this is a capability that is going to win you a war, Russia is going to win the war much, much sooner than Ukraine. So again, it's one of these things that it'll cause more death and destruction. It'll drag everything out longer, but it's not going to change the outcome.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit technical now, and either of you can kind of jump in on this. So these drones that have flown very deep into Russian territory, they would use some sort of maybe GPS satellite signal or something. I mean, that's one thing. Could they have been done using Starlink? And is GPS available over Russia? And thirdly, how is this possible in a technical sense? I mean, isn't Russia shutting down all of these Starlink signals or GPS signals over Russia? I mean, we're in a war scenario here. I mean, technically, how would they fly these drones that far into Russian territory?
I think these older systems have internal guidance. They have a gyroscope and other ways of keeping track of where it is in space. Just in space general, not outer space. This is a way of knowing where it is. This is actually a really good way of safing your equipment from jamming, like jamming GLONASS or GPS. Is if you have an internal system that is keeping track of where you are, the orientation, the distance you're flying, the direction you're flying, you're actually able to guide a missile, a rocket, an aircraft to a specific point on Earth, just like GPS. And I'm willing to bet that there was something like that. GPS, it's a global network. It has global coverage, and so unless you're in a specific area in Russia where there's electronic warfare systems operating, canceling out the signal, you're probably going to be able to receive a signal from that, from GLONASS, from Beidou, the Chinese version, Galileo. The European Union has their own satellite navigation system. So there's a lot of ways they could have done it. And I don't think in that sense there was a lot Russia could do to stop it. What they need to do is tell their air defenses to pay attention more closely and be at a higher level of readiness.
Sure. So it brings me on to the next question. This is for Alex. So do you think this was some sort of test by NATO to basically test the defenses of Russia in case things escalate in the future, and this war escalates between NATO and Russia? Well, this is some sort of, they were just testing the waters to see how far they can get, and they were just testing the Russian defenses. What do you think, Alex?
I think, as I was talking earlier, in March, they flew this over Romania without even noticing anything. I mean, Americans are in Romania big time, and this didn't get caught. I mean, these are launched off the back of trucks, big trucks. They tilt back the drone, they shoot them off there, they blast. It's like, I'm going to try to simplify this, make it sound a little bit even easier. They got lucky. It's like throwing an airplane, paper airplane, one direction, and that's it. Not much time to go off the grid on these things. Remember, these things were built for pretty much reconnaissance. And it's like that. They've maybe put some special secret payload on there to explode, but it's a suicide mission. It's, and that's exactly what it's done. These are pretty much outdated equipment. I don't think it poses too much of a threat. I don't think they have an endless supply of these, and I don't think they'd actually go back to manufacture them. I think it actually shows weakness of NATO to actually say, wait a minute, guys, why are you floating these up into the air? A, you're going to irritate the heck out of Russia. They're going to come back and hit you harder. And B, this is old technology. I mean, this stuff was headed for the garage. Some of these are in the museum. Okay, I mean, these are 70s stuff. It's sitting in some of these museums right now. So they fired them up. Some guys maybe said, hey, what's this? We haven't used it yet. Let's throw it against the wall and see what sticks. That's exactly, I think, what's happened here. Should Russia be concerned about it? I mean, it's not nice to see some of these drop on people or actually be suicide missions, but that's exactly what they are. It doesn't surprise me. Ukraine did it. When they make a mistake, they blame it on Russia. I'm surprised that they haven't taken credit for this. Maybe they're too embarrassed to take credit for this. I don't know, but that's my 2 cents. But this is old technology. These things are equipped with camera equipment to fly reconnaissance, and even the camera equipment in there, I think it would cost, as Brian knows these things quite well. These would refit it to bring it up to technology today, to be sending back information back. It's just not worth it for these guys. I mean, NATO's giving them better stuff than that. I mean, even a bloody DJI drone is probably more equipped than some of these things.
Yeah, I was going to talk about Chinese drones, and I was going to ask you how they differ compared to the drones that we've seen in this conflict. And obviously, we've seen the Iranian drones, we've seen Russia's own drones, we've seen the Ukrainian drones, but the Chinese drones, which are out and about, these are probably years and years. I mean, we're talking about decades at more advanced, using AI and all of the latest technology, Beidou, navigation. What's your thoughts? Brian, I mean, what do you think? Would you compare the Chinese drones compared to what we've seen in this conflict so far?
This is something that's really hard to tell. You don't know until they are actually used. We could just assume that. I mean, not to take anything away from Iran, they have brilliant scientists, engineers, designers, but if they're able to create something like what Russia is now using the Garan to, I'm pretty sure China can make something similar to that. So that's an example of something very simple that they can make in huge numbers to overwhelm air defenses. They could have things that are much more sophisticated. As far as I know, DJI is a Chinese company in Shenzhen, and people are familiar with the consumer drones, but they have much higher end systems, and not just drones, but network software and systems to automate things. And could you just imagine what these Chinese developers, designers, and engineers would be able to do if the military gave them a budget and said, just go wild, whatever you want to do. They have huge potential because of their industrial base and the human talent in China. We always hear that Chinese people can't innovate. They're stealing everything from the US. But there's so many examples of things only China is doing, or China is doing better than anyone else. So how do you account for that? So I think there's a huge amount of ignorance, arrogance, and we use this word again, complacency, but in this case, among the West, regarding the capabilities China has. I would not underestimate them. If anything, the West should be erring on the side of caution, and they aren't. And they've done the same thing with Russia, and look at what's happening now in Ukraine.
100% right. And you're right, it is very much ignorance. And you've seen some major CEOs from major companies in US coming out with statements saying China cannot innovate. And it's very much ignorance, like you said. And, drone warfare, I believe, is the future. And you've seen how much damage drones can do. And imagine if you have an arsenal of hundreds of thousands of these drones, and the country which can produce most of these drones at a very cheap cost and produce them in numbers, hundreds of thousands, they would have the clear advantage in any future war. So let's go back to Zelensky now. And I don't know if you've seen his picture on Time magazine. I don't know about you, but when I was young, I thought Time magazine was the ultimate magazine, the place to be. And if your face is on Time magazine, then you must be absolutely great. I mean, what the hell has Time magazine come to these days? And absolutely, what's your thoughts on this? And I was absolutely shocked to see his face in there. I mean, what's going on here? Have they sold themselves?
First, Alex?
Yeah, I think, Time magazine has hit it right a few times, but all you got to do is go back and look at the late 30s, who was on the cover of Time magazine. I believe it was 1938, 1939. Could be wrong on the years there, but there's two famous people. I'm not going to mention their names on this program, but I think I'll leave that up to the viewers to go back and just Google the front page of 1938 Time and 1939 Time magazine. And I wouldn't, if I was Zelensky, I wouldn't be bragging about.
Are you talking about Mr.
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't. There's both. There's a few of them. There's a few people on there.
He's from Germany,
right? And I believe Stalin was also on the cover as well during these times. but after you guys are done talking about that, I got an interesting point I want to bring up before I leave the program today. It's important. So whenever you got a moment, just squeeze me in there, and then that would be great.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll just finish up on this thought, and then you could go ahead, Alex. You know, depending on who is on the cover and why, because exactly. I think Vladimir Putin was also on the cover, but it was not, to celebrate or cheer him on. It was to undermine him. Time Magazine, Newsweek, it doesn't really matter. They have direct connections with the U.S. State Department, and that's what it is. It is a mouthpiece for the U.S. State Department to help advance U.S. foreign policy objectives, and that's what they're doing. And they put people like Zelensky on the cover, and they celebrate him to build up the illusion of credibility. And because he has none, he was put into power. He was built up politically, installed into power, and he is propped up to this day by the U.S. and the rest of NATO. He would not be where he is without that. He achieved nothing, and he will ultimately be the scapegoat everything is dumped on and flushed when all of this is over. So a very predictable process, and then we've watched this happen over and over again. We've seen the leaders of all of these opposition groups the U.S. creates and perpetuates in every country, either on the front cover or somewhere in Time Magazine or Newsweek or CNN or BBC. It's creating false legitimacy for their proxies and puppets, really.
But don't you think they've built him up too much? And it's like having a child, and if you give the child everything that they want, they're gonna grow up to be spoilt. And that is exactly what's happened to Zelensky. And this Time Magazine article happened along the same timelines as the attacks in Russia. And I remember on record, the US has said they will not stand for any attacks in Russian territory. They will not authorize it. They will not allow it. They promised Russia that would not happen. And as soon as this picture came up on Time Magazine, next thing I saw was these attacks on Russia. It's almost like he's gone too big for his boots, and now he's like, "Oh, you can't touch me now. I'll do whatever I want." Well, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's them continuously painting themselves into a corner. The more they prop him up and build him up, and the more they double down on saying, we're not negotiating with Russia, we're not going to stop until every Russian troop is out of, even Crimea and the Donbass. The more they do that, the tighter the corner is that they painted themselves in, and the more impossible it becomes getting out. So this is the real danger of doing this. But as Alex and Alexander on the Duran always say, they have no reverse gear. I think they put that perfectly. There is no reverse gear, and there's no reason to expect them to suddenly discover or install a reverse gear.
Mm-hmm.
Alex, how long have you got? I know you said you've only got.
Yeah, I got about 10 minutes. I just want to say that I completely agree with what Brian is saying. They have painted themselves in the corner. They can't get anywhere. And if you're worried about the young child feel like he's getting everything, I mean, he's an actor. He knows how to handle the fame. And here's something interesting. Here's a movie that was made. I don't know if I can get that zoomed in or not. But anyway, it was called The Sniper. And The Sniper was funded by the Ukrainian State Film Agency in 2019. And it's a pro-Ukrainian movie about the Donbass. And interesting that it was funded by the Ukraine State Film Agency. This is years before Russia decided to get involved here. Also, there's something of unique on the cover of this. You'll see it. And once again, the movie's called Sniper the White Raven. You will see the Ukrainian Film Agency as the logo there, and then the UM Group. Now, who funded the UM group? This was a group that was partially subsidiary, was in the British Virgin Islands. Try find something on the UM group on the internet. It's been washed, completely gone. So we cannot find who is actually funding this major propaganda piece. Is it an NGO organization? Is it the State Department? And Brian has mentioned time and time and time again how these organizations work. And I commend you for continuing getting that message out to everyone, Brian, because it's so important. And finally, people are waking up that this is like a, a la carte menu. All right, let's invade a country, okay? Or let's destabilize a country. What do we need? NGOs. What else do we need? State propaganda. What else do we need? NATO on side. What else do we need? US budget passed by Congress. It's just categorically insane. And, as you dig down, as I was digging down into these movies produced, I found 4 more movies that were produced by 4 more companies that magically their backers, BVI-based companies, British Virgin Island companies, financing through a subsidiary into a Ukrainian film being broadcasted on the screens, funded and also supported by the Ukrainian State Film Agency. What? That makes absolutely no sense. And you go back and you try to categorically do that, and you find it's very simple to find British Virgin Island companies, the BVIs. They have a registry there, but what they don't tell you is that they have trust companies, and these trust companies usually have a board of director that hide the beneficial owner of these companies. And this was supposed to be, passed in the European laws years ago. My last point, I need to bring this up, and gentlemen, I appreciate your patience with me here. I don't know if you guys are aware of the Bank of International Settlements. They're a huge foundation that they basically are owned by the central banks. Most of the central banks in the world own them, okay? They're based, of course, in Switzerland, in Basel. Now, Basel is a big banking, very quiet canton in Switzerland, very quiet, but a lot of banking business goes on there. I'm going to bring up a couple of things for you guys to kind of pay attention to here. And this is for the viewers here. Just want to see if I can bring this up on the screen. And thank you, AJ, for allowing me to spend some time showing these people. If we have a look at this here, I don't know if we can get that on the screen, if that's coming up. Yep. You'll see that the National Bank of Ukraine is hoping for soonest admission to Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, the exact firm I'm talking about now. Now, why is there such a push on a country that is in the middle of a war to become part of the BIS? Well, something is not right here in the banking system. Okay, and we see this, across the financial, we'll call it ticker tapes in very small writing. It comes across, you very seldom see it, and you really got to catch it. Okay, well, here's why, and here's what's going on with it. So the BIS, now we'll connect the dots. Okay, so first of all, BIS is basically helps the FX trading for most, I would say 60 of the largest countries through financial services. They do a lot of business. Ukraine wants to join this. Now, why is Ukraine so adamant to be part of this group when the country is broke? Okay, we're talking cash. All right, well, something's wrong here. And here is the headline right there. Global financial system vulnerable to 80 trillion plus problem in the FX market. Apparently, they're having problems tracking about $60 trillion in transactions over the last year here. And they cannot, for some reason, get to the bottom of it. And I'm thinking that we are seeing one of the largest washing machines in action here. Remember, 3 dead crypto billionaires in the last 30 days. We are seeing a very reputable Bank of International Settlement based in Basel for almost 100 years. And now they're seeing an FX problem between 60 to 80 billion that they can't find out what's happened here. And you just have to connect the dots. The Monaco Battalion, billionaires, Ukraine. American Congress passing money. BIS saying, guys, we're missing some information here. And then the Ukraine putting their foot to the floor to try to be part of this Bank of International Settlements. I didn't know banking was that great in the Ukraine, but I guess with instability and starting a war and having the Americans back you up, I guess it's a great business to be in. Anyway, that's my 2 cents, AJ, and I'll stick around for 5 minutes, but of course I'm done with everything. I appreciate you guys giving me the time. I was limited today, but Brian, it's so great to share the screen with you again. I really would look forward to having a more in-depth conversation, but for my viewers that are watching, and as well, AJ covers some amazing stuff. Please subscribe to these gentlemen's channels. They put in a tremendous amount of time and energy into the research. And Brian, I am so happy that we have you during this time, because without voices of yourself, the Duran, Ira O'Gray, AJ, Patrick Lancaster, Eva, I mean, we would only hear one side of the story. And my hat's off to you. I commend what you do. I know it's difficult. So thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you too, Alex. I mean, you contribute as well, and I really value your contributions, and I always learn a lot every time we have these conversations, including just now what you're laying out about it's a washing machine. I hear more.
I'll send you all this notes over. So, I mean, I know you go in depth, man. So I know you're going to pick this apart and probably come up with a pretty clear conclusion here. So my pleasure to hand over anything to help the cause. Thanks again, guys. Really, thank you very much.
Before you go, Alex,
sure.
I saw a picture on Instagram. This was 2 days ago. There was a Ferrari parked outside Harrods in London. And a lot of people assumed that it was probably owned by a sheikh or some sort of Arab. And to a lot of people's surprise, it had Ukrainian number plates on it. And somebody actually on Instagram zoomed in on the Ukrainian number plate. And, London at one point used to be called Londongrad. That was this nickname because they used to let in a lot of Russian oligarchs come in, buy properties, put money into London. You had Roman Abramovich buying Chelsea, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And now, it seems like a lot of oligarchs coming in from Ukraine are replacing these Russians. These Russians are being kicked out. They're being sanctioned, and now they're being replaced by these Ukrainian oligarchs. And you have them parking outside Harrods. They're going out on their shopping sprees. They probably all got golden visas. And and this looks like what's happening. And you see, and there was somebody who did an audit on some of the properties that are being sold in London. And there's one particular property called One Hyde Park, and each apartment costs around 32 million. And we're talking about 1 or 2 bedroom apartment each costs like 32 million. And I think the penthouse is like 300 million or something like that. And all of them are basically, most of them are signed to Russian oligarchs, not Russian, Ukrainian oligarchs, and Ukrainian companies as well. And it's just absolutely crazy. They're all just now replacing all the Russian oligarchs with the Ukrainian ones.
And probably getting a deal, selling the seized yachts back to the Ukrainians that they've seized from the Russians. All the assets that the Russians had, all these banks and the European Commission, Vander, whatever, she's been, saying that she's seizing or freezing these. And some of them are up for liquidation. I mean, just a week and a half ago, one of the opposition members of the opposition for Zelensky, his $200 million yacht was seized in Croatia. And it's set to be auctioned off. I mean, I'm not saying that every side here is squeaky clean, but we're talking big money this time. This isn't a Middle East washing machine going on here. This is big money. And when the BIS is involved, the Bank of International Settlement, and they're rushing and hoping for Ukraine to get in there quickly, that there is a ton of money that is going through the FX. And why are 3 mysterious deaths happening in the crypto market? Billionaires in the last 30 days. You can't make this stuff up. It's real. It's happening right before our eyes. This is a huge business, and I think media has really caught up to it. and there is a side that is not bending the knee. You know, in some of these Middle East countries where, you know, the United States went in, and Brian, you would know this better than I do, they had pretty decent control over the events and the media. Well, enter Vladimir Putin. He's not going to get pushed. He's not going to get pushed over here. And I think the West is starting to understand, wait a minute, we're bleeding so much money here. How long is this going to go on? And while they're at it, they're just pushing everything they can. Yeah, well, Sun Yan, that's interesting. Bank of International Settlement is not under any jurisdiction. So BIS, sorry, it's to be technical on you there. The BIS is actually the central bank cooperation, but it is in Basel. And I would say that where there's the computer, that is where I would say there is jurisdiction. Where all that hardware is and where all those lines are, it doesn't matter. It's down to jurisdiction. Hopefully that helps, AJ. I'm going to sit backstage and watch you guys for a minute. And thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks,
you. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks again.
Bye, guys.
Thanks. Bye. So, Brian, I'm just going to change the subject now. We're going to go talking about Ursula. Sometimes I call her Ulrika, because but obviously her name's Ursula. And Alex mentioned Ursula's mentioning something about taking away assets of Russia. I believe they have around 300 billion. And I remember watching the Duran as well. And Alexander said that it's definitely not legal. You cannot seize assets from a person or from a country. It's never been done. It's not legal. And Ursula said a lot of things. She also said that 100,000 Ukrainians had died. But that is a very small number, because there is a petition apparently flying around in Ukraine of 300,000 signatures from wives and loved ones who basically do not know where their husbands are, or their sons, or their fathers. They've pretty much gone missing in the war, and that seems more like a likely number of 300,000 being killed or missing or wounded. Because end of the day, Brian, if you want to count the war dead, you've got to identify the body, and you can only identify the body if you know who that is. If someone's been blown up, for example, their face is blown up or body parts are blown up, there is no way you can identify that body. So they're not going to be counted as dead, right? They're just going to be missing. So what's your thoughts on Ursula, her two statements about seizing Russian assets, and also the 100,000 that's supposedly been killed? I just think it's much more than that, more closer to 300. What's your thoughts?
Well, I would defer to Alex, who is just with us. I think he's more in tune with these financial issues, and also the Duran. I think they were spot on. It's completely illegal. If there was a clear path to do this and it was legitimate, they would have already have done it by now. The problem is when they do this, if and when they do this, regardless of it being legal or illegal or without precedent, it is going to further undermine the West. And this is all that, we were talking about painting themselves into a corner. They're also undermining this whole system that they've created, the so-called international rules-based order. They're completely undermined. They're demolishing it right now with each one of these things that they're doing. And who is going to want to do business with the West when the West just does whatever it feels like, whenever it feels like? This is people's money. This is the funds of another nation, and it's just being snatched up. And also private property being snatched up just because of somebody's nationality. This should scare everyone, and this should be an impetus for everyone to divest from the West and place their money somewhere else that is safer. And where is safer than in the West? Pretty much anywhere is safer than in the West. Now, the comment on 100,000 and what you were just saying, well, I think it's actually closer to what the Ministry of Defense of Russia said. And I think it was actually under 100,000 dead. And then tens of thousands more wounded. And the reason why you could have a petition with 300,000 names is because each soldier most likely has more than one loved one who would want to sign that petition. So I think that's how you would have a huge number of people signing it. Whole families whose son, brother, father, cousin, even friend died. They would want to put their name on that petition. Yep. I would if I was Ukrainian. And that's that's the ugly part of this whole conflict, because so many are dying. Maybe not 300,000, maybe around at this time almost 100,000. That's still a huge number of human beings dying, and that is something that just as human beings is repugnant that this is happening, but also in terms of tactical and strategic interests. This is unsustainable. There's no way Ukraine can sustain this. They do not have an unlimited pool of manpower to send into the fight, and we're seeing the consequences of that. We were hearing about how the tide has turned. Ukraine pushed through and took all of Kharkov, how they pushed the Russians out of Kherson City, when actually Russia made a very deliberate and conscious choice to leave Kherson City after defeating wave after wave of Ukrainian attacks. We kept hearing how the tide turned, but then we're watching in Bakhmut, even the Western media admit that Ukraine cannot do anything at all to stop Russian advances in this key city. This is part of one of Ukraine's last major defensive lines in the east. It is essential for them to hold on to it, and they cannot, which says they are overstretched. Russian forces were overstretched, but they called in 300,000 additional troops. What can Ukraine call in? They have nothing left. They're talking about training 19,000 troops in the UK over the course of next year. That is not enough to get through 2 or 3 months. So what are they going to do for the rest of the year? This is their problem that they have right now. I still have to look into this article. There's an organization called the Mozart Group, and it's Western American and other NATO troops. They're off duty. They're part of this NGO or whatever, private military contractor, and they're supposed to be in Ukraine on the ground training Ukrainian troops. And even they admit how futile all of this is. One more thing about her claim of 100,000. When she said it, she specifically said 100,000 Ukrainian officers. And what does this indicate? This indicates that she knows absolutely nothing at all about armed conflict, past or present, because anyone with even casual knowledge of the military knows that there's officers and there's enlisted. You have the officers with the swords and the shiny insignia, if you know nothing else about how a military is organized. And then you have all of the other people that the officers are in charge of. So when she says 100,000 Ukrainian officers, it's apparent that she's aloof. She knows she's disconnected from reality. She knows nothing about the military, and I believe she was the minister.
Yeah,
of
defense minister in Germany.
Yeah,
defense minister. Yep.
And this points to something systemic across the entire West. People getting into positions they are not qualified for in any conceivable way. And then imagine the damage this does when more and more positions are occupied by people who have no idea what they're doing. And so we're watching it. We're watching it unfold right now in Ukraine, and how this conflict in Ukraine is impacting geopolitics around the world. The price cap that the West is trying to impose, and how no one else in the world is interested or going to go along with it, which means it was dead on arrival.
Yep.
But they're still doing it because they're painting themselves into a corner, and they can't do anything but continue doing it.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up next, actually. And you're 100% right. And names like Liz Truss comes in mind, who ended up becoming Prime Minister of UK with no qualifications whatsoever. And you've seen how disastrous that ended up. But it's not just Liz Truss. We're talking about the rest of the G7, the rest of the Western world, because agreeing to this price cap, anybody with any source of common sense or knowledge about how the system works, or basic buying and selling, just a basic knowledge of buying and selling, you would think that this price cap will never ever work. I mean, it's never worked in the past. What do they think it would? How would they think they can control the oil market when the the West doesn't even own, a third of the oil? I mean, US, this oil price cap idea has come from Janet Yellen, and people don't realize that USA is pretty much self-sufficient when it comes to oil and gas, so they're fine, even if the rest of the world decided not to sell oil to the United States. They're fine. They've got enough oil to be self-sufficient. Europeans don't, and that's the problem. Europeans are not self-sufficient when it comes to oil and gas, and for them to agree to this oil price cap, it's just beggars belief. And what makes it even more stupid is you have Polish, Latvia, Estonia calling the price cap to be down to like $30 or something. It's almost like, somebody knocking on my door and saying, "Oh, you're going to sell me your house, but I'm going to pay you like $100." What do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to, close the door in their faces. So it's absolutely beggars belief how moronic and idiotic some of these Western leaders are, and how they've completely gone along with this scam, and all agreed to it. And for them to come out and say, "Oh, we should set the price cap to $30." I mean, how are they going to set the price cap to $30 when the current price of oil right now is between $80 to $85? Russia's selling it at a discount to obviously China and India for around 60, 65. It just beggars belief. What's your thoughts on this?
You're right, AJ. It's completely insane. And they're doing all of this based on the way they thought the world was at a certain point, a world that is not like that anymore, where they could just declare something and everyone would get in line because of the amount of coercive power that they used to have or used to think they had. It's just not working anymore. As the playing field levels economically, politically, militarily, their ability to just declare something and everyone to just do it diminishes. And that's what we're watching, I think. I think they had a basket of ideas, so to speak, a basket of ideas of what they could do with Russia. And they were rushing to announce all of them because they didn't know what else to do. It didn't seem like they had a contingency plan. Once Russia went in, they put the sanctions on Russia. They did extreme sanctions that no one thought they would have done, but they did it, and it did not have the impact that they thought it would have. And I don't think they had a viable contingency plan if it didn't work. Russia had multiple contingency plans, on one on top of the other, and they were fully prepared to implement each one in turn as they came to it. So this is the difference. One side of this conflict was prepared, the other side wasn't, and it's an irony that it was the West who provoked this whole conflict to begin with, deliberately. I just saw in the comment you put up on the screen, AJ, about Brittany Griner being released. I think there was an exchange between the U.S. and Russia for Victor Bout, who I think was caught in Thailand and he was extradited to the U.S. and that was a big issue back then. I'll have to look into that before I talk about it anymore. And I thought I saw another question in the chat about Mongolia. I'm looking into the situation in Mongolia. The United States, through the National Endowment for Democracy, is heavily involved in Mongolia. U.S. aid also. I've actually talked about it in the past, but not really in depth. So this is something I have to look at. All I want to say is that the Power Siberia 2 pipeline is supposed to go through Mongolia, and now all of a sudden you have protests. Very suspicious. People really need to follow the money. Like Alex was talking about, and as I have always said, protests don't just spontaneously come out onto the streets. There's always someone organizing them, whether it's a good protest or bad, and whether these are good or bad people organizing them. They always exist. Find them, who they are, and follow the money so we can just decipher what's actually happening. And AJ, was there another thing that you asked me, or maybe it was another question I saw?
No, it was
about
just about the
training.
price, the training.
Training, the 3 weeks training in the UK, a few thousand Ukrainian conscripts, and they're asking about how they train the Ukrainians when they go to the UK. And actually, if you read the articles about the UK training program, I don't know if it's 3 weeks or 5 weeks. It doesn't matter. It's not enough. It has an entry-level infantryman needs about 6 months of training to be effective on the battlefield, and they're not going to get anywhere near that. And they admit that. Who's explaining these things to these Ukraine? And this is not like the Russian mobilization. The 300,000 plus being mobilized in Russia have a military background. They have gone through their training. They have experience doing their job, maybe not in combat, but they have experience, military experience. The people going to UK are people pulled off the street, conscripted, who have no military background. Who's doing the interpretation? There's a shortage of people who can do the interpretation between the trainers and the recruits. And if the interpreter has no military knowledge and they're trying to relay these concepts to a Ukrainian conscript who also has no idea about anything military, it's going to be a disaster.
That's right.
This one.
Yeah,
is that Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this because this is how they're training Ukrainian troops. And one thing you may have noticed, and they're doing urban warfare. They're doing like house to house, door to door, urban warfare. And one thing about this one, I mean, you can see, look here, they're going from door to door, house to house. One thing about this war that, people can see from a distance is this is not an urban warfare war. I mean, this is basically mainly down to artillery. Russia's using rocket attacks, artillery attacks, and long range mainly. I mean, this is never ever about urban warfare. Nobody's going from house to house trying to clear these houses out. So I don't know what kind of training the British are teaching Ukraine, but it's definitely for the wrong war. I think they got the wars mixed up. And what can you teach in like 3 weeks? There's not much you can teach. And most of these Ukrainians probably don't even speak English, right? And
exactly.
they're probably going in there with no clue what's going on. And probably the first thing on their mind is, how do we make sure we don't go back to Ukraine? How do we make sure we stay in UK?
Yeah. And I wouldn't blame them. I wouldn't think any less of them for doing that either. Those are all really good questions, AJ. I could only I could speak to my experience and also, what we see here and how it's playing out on the ground. I wouldn't say that there's no urban combat taking place, or I wouldn't say urban, but house to house. In the Donbas region is actually a very built up place, but you're also right. There's a lot of just like trench warfare, I guess you could call it, and long range artillery. That is a huge component, and this is something I've been saying this over and over again, and I think even the Western media is starting to come around and realize that they can't cover this up anymore. If Russia has artillery, huge amounts of artillery, along with ammunition to fire from these artillery pieces, they have tanks, they have armored vehicles, they have military aviation, they have drones, they have long-range missiles like the Iskander complex, or cruise missiles of all kinds, and Ukraine doesn't have any of these things, or does not have them in any large numbers, not sufficient numbers. It doesn't matter what you train these troops to do, how well they're trained, whether it's 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, it doesn't matter, because they do not have the means to fight this conflict. They simply don't have the tools they need to do this. And this is not something you can make up for. People don't understand. They watch Hollywood and they think that these things that they see in these movies are real. It is totally different. It is a totally different experience when you fire real guns, machine guns, throw a grenade, watch artillery being fired. I was actually in an artillery unit when I was in the Marine Corps. It's completely different, and you start to grasp the gravity of modern warfare, how powerful these weapons are, and how daunting it would be to be on the wrong end of them. And this is something that you're training them in the UK for operating small arms, these anti-tank weapons, which are not as capable as they're being sold as. you're sending them to die. Essentially, that's what the UK is doing. They're suckering them in and sending them to go die. Well-trained US troops who have gone through 6 months or more of training, and they're in their units. They are infantry, and they are training with anti-tank weapons, a variety of anti-tank weapons. There are papers published by the US military about how they had a 19% 19% chance of just hitting the target. Not even talking about whether they hit it in a place that would damage or destroy the tank. 19%. And those are properly trained US troops. What chance do these Ukrainian conscripts who are getting abbreviated and inadequate training, what chance do they have of setting up the fields of fire properly, taking out a map, figuring out the ranges, setting up the kill zones properly? What chance do they have of actually doing that if US soldiers that are properly trained have such a hard time doing that? Single digit percentage. Single digit.
I want to show you this clip, Brian, and it's absolutely hilarious. This is a clip of US Army training Afghan troops. And when I saw this, I literally fell off my seat. I mean, this is the training that the US was giving the Afghan army. I was just laughing my head off.
Well, I think that this brings up a really good point. The U.S. spent how many years and how much money
$2
how
trillion,
much
exactly, and this is what they've come up with. I mean, look at that.
Yes, and transferring how much weaponry to them, and they folded up almost overnight.
These guys are just having a laugh. Look, these guys are just having a laugh. I mean, they just went in there to kind of spend all of that money with no end goal inside. They had no intention of training these troops, and
no real practical way of
and it's the same thing happening now to Ukraine. They have no intention of training these Ukrainians. They just want to send them to die, and that's what's happening. Just get the money, tick in the box. Yeah, we've trained these troops. Send them to the battlefield. That's it. Our job is done. We don't care if they die or not.
Exactly. Actually, exactly, because that was the case for Afghanistan. I forget what these reports were, but these reports would come out every so often, and it was like this special inspector general. It's some sort of oversight mechanism the U.S. came up with to overwatch all of this spending on Afghanistan. And when you read through all these programs, you're thinking, if they're actually doing this, they are going to turn Afghanistan into the 51st state of America, because this is extensive in depth and in breadth, the programs that they've got listed. But then you realize the reason why this is not actually happening is because these are contractors that just want to make their money. They do the very bare minimum to meet the requirements to get that money, and then they want to get back and spend that money. They're not interested. They couldn't care less if these programs are actually viable, if they succeed or not. And as a matter of fact, if they fail, it's actually better for them because they'll be called up and given another contract to redo it. So this is why Afghanistan failed, and this is exactly why Ukraine failed, because there's nobody, not enough people with principles who think about it. There's no moral imperative for what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine or in Afghanistan or Iraq or in any of these places they're meddling. There is no moral imperative, so you're not going to attract people with principles who will do the job properly because they believe in it. It is all a money grab, and when it's all a money grab, it is guaranteed to fail, and it is failing, and that is one of the reasons why. I think that's a really good point. Showing that video and bringing up Afghanistan, I think, is a very valuable example to compare with the current situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. And you remember Biden said, under no circumstances would the Taliban would take over Afghanistan. The Afghan army has been trained by the best soldiers for a couple of years. They will be able to hold Afghanistan. 2 days later, they've all just collapsed, and you can see why, because you can see the kind of training they've been taught. And people forget that during the time when they were using the Afghan soldiers, they had very good support from the air. They had support from the obviously US military. But as soon as the US military just disappeared in the middle of the night, these Afghan soldiers had no idea what to do, because in the past they had a lot of support, air support and GPS and many other technologies. And now they've just been left to fend for themselves, and they're like, they're like, oh, you know what, this ain't worth it. Let's just quit. And this is exactly
Yeah.
what's happened. They just all just quit overnight.
Yes, and fight for what? To
Yeah.
fight for in Afghanistan, the U.S. Forced onto the people in that region. So again, no moral imperative. If you read The Art of War, moral leadership, moral imperative is one of the essential ingredients for victory. If there's no point to be fighting, it's going to be very hard to convince men to go and fight and die. At least in Ukraine, they can convince a certain number of people that, oh, you're fighting for, this is existential for Ukraine. They don't realize that their sovereignty disappeared in 2014, not late February. It was already gone, and no matter how hard they fight the Russians, Russia did not take their sovereignty from them. The United States did, so they're pointed in the wrong direction, essentially. So ultimately, the moral imperative is not on their side, but they've convinced large numbers of people that it is. So I think it helps a little bit, but again, it just draws everything out longer than say Afghanistan. So we'll draw everything out longer. More people will die, but at the end of the day, it's not going to change anything because ultimately there is no moral imperative for what the U.S. is trying to do in Ukraine.
So I had one other questions for the price cap, and before we move on, and I was going to ask you, how do you think Russia will react to this price cap? And I've read some reports coming out, the fact that Russia is setting up their own price cap. It's called a price flooring, which means they are not going to sell it for anything below a certain price. And people forget that Russia is already selling to China and also India, and these are huge markets. And if Russia decides to only sell to India and China and not sell to anyone else, surely the oil prices will go up, because oil is a commodity which is very, very finite. There's not enough of it around the world. As countries are coming out of lockdowns, as China is coming out of lockdowns, they will need more energy, more oil. Southeast Asian countries, which are becoming more and more modern, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, even Laos, they will need more energy because more and more factories are going into these countries. They will need more oil. So the demand for oil is actually increasing, not decreasing. And US has barely enough oil for itself. And US still, even though US is the highest producer of oil, most of it is shale oil, which is they use it with fracking and stuff, but then they have to refine it. But they still import a lot of Russian oil as well, a lot of Middle Eastern oil. And how do you think? And OPEC has got also many kind of tricks up its sleeve as well. They can always kind of reduce the capacity of the amount of oil that comes out of the OPEC plus countries. So there's still many tools that the Arabians can play and also Russian can play. How do you think they will react? They've already reacted, haven't they? But the markets are still kind of steady at the moment. But I think that's because China is still under lockdown, but it's coming out of lockdown. But I think the oil prices will probably hit the $100 once China is in full swing again. So what's your thoughts?
This is not my area of expertise. Again, I listen to the Duran because this is one of the things that they do an excellent job on, and I defer to their conclusions or analysis on this. But what I will say is that you see Russia selling to China, selling to India, and India especially, because India is supposed to be some sort of ally of the United States. And India plays a balancing or performs a balancing act between East and West. But more and more countries, they see India doing it. They don't understand why they shouldn't buy cheap energy from Russia and have an advantage over now Europe, pricing themselves out of competition in terms of industry. The United States, they're sending, if I'm not mistaken, they are sending hydrocarbons to Europe. The whole plan is to replace Russian gas piped in to Europe with liquid natural gas shipped across the ocean, which will always be more expensive. So even in the long term, if quantity the quantities are fixed, and Europe is able to get as much energy as they need. They're still pricing themselves out of competition with the rest of, say, Eurasia, Asia, and manufacturing happening there. So it's a process of deindustrialization. It's a process that's going to solidify the subordination of Europe under the United States. But okay, the US has subordinated Europe. Notice how I'm not mentioning anything Russia is doing. This is all things the West is doing to itself. Europe is doing this to themselves. Ukraine and Zelensky, we talk about a client regime. That is a microcosm of what's going on across all of Europe. The leadership in power across Europe, they are answering and serving U.S. interests, not Europe's interests, very obviously. So they're pricing themselves out of competition. They are deindustrializing themselves, and they are cementing the subordination of Europe under the United States. There was a moment before all of this happened, when Nord Stream 2 was being built, where there was hope that Europe would be able to get out from under the shadow of U.S. hegemony and establish themselves as a truly independent bloc on the global stage, pursue their interests. They would have continued dealings with the United States, obviously, but they would also have dealings with Russia and China. That would have benefited absolutely everyone, including the United States. But the people all the way at the top, they cannot accept this. They want to have everything. They don't believe in multipolarism. They want everyone answering to them. It's irrational. It's impractical. It's a fantasy, and because it's a fantasy, it's crumbling. Now, what is Russia going to do? Well, they're not going. They said they're not going to sell oil or energy to countries playing this price cap game. So they will just simply, as you said, they will just sell it to everyone else, anyone else who wants to buy it. It's not something that they have a hard time finding buyers for. Europe is being and the United States are being incredibly irrational. Everyone else in the world, they need cheap energy. They will continue buying cheap energy from Russia.
So talking about multipolarism, we are leading up to the next question. We have President Xi landed in Saudi Arabia yesterday to an amazing welcome. A proper red carpet was rolled out, or should I say purple carpet. But he had the grand parade. He was met at the airport by all the leaders. He's been given a great time, as opposed to the damp squib that Biden got when he landed in Saudi Arabia. So are we seeing the start of the end of the dollar, de-dollarization? Because, they're obviously discussing a few things, and I believe there might be some news coming out of Saudi Arabia over the next few days. And there's already people saying that Saudi Arabia will agree to sell oil to China in yuan. This would mean a number of things. Mainly, China is the number one trading partner for Saudi Arabia, and this would mean that no longer does China need to buy oil using dollar anymore. And if they don't need that, they do not need to hold as much dollars in the central banks anymore, which means they can dump these dollars. These dollars will end up back in the US with higher inflation. Japan itself has already dumped over $1 trillion US dollars to kind of save their own currency. And there seems to be a major de-dollarization push going on around the world. And also Saudi Arabia probably will announce that they're going to be joining BRICS as well. They're probably going to produce their own reserve currency, a BRICS reserve currency. Are we seeing the beginning of the end of the dollar, Brian?
Yeah, it's been in the works for a long time, and now it's accelerating. And ironically, it's accelerating not because of what China, Russia, and many other nations around the world are doing, but the belligerence and the empty coercion that the West is still trying to wield to get everyone else back in line. The world is changing. They don't want to accept that it is. And so they're irrationally trying to double down on a strategy that makes absolutely no sense. It is a strategy that does not fit the reality that we see in the world right now. Multipolarism is a real thing, and it's not going away. It's rooted in many different factors that they simply cannot control. There are things that have happened that they cannot put back in the bottle, so to speak. I'm looking at the percentage that's where Saudi Arabia exports and imports from, and you're absolutely right. In both cases, it's China, and overwhelmingly, exports are to Asia. Overwhelmingly to
Yep,
the rest of Asia, and
exactly.
imports, it's Asia is the largest, and followed by Europe, and then the U.S. is very small.
Yep.
And I think the situation Saudi Arabia is in, this is why people have to be a little, and myself included, because I was not always like this, but we have to be more sophisticated in the way we look and judge nations and what they're doing. To say that this country is a U.S. ally, sometimes they have a close relationship with the U.S. because the U.S. has them in a headlock and has a gun buried in their rib cage. They're a hostage, and I think a lot of countries are in that situation. A lot of countries have regimes that are put into power and kept in power by the United States. They depend on on the U.S. for their survival, but the country itself suffers because of this arrangement. I would say many countries in the Middle East that are, friendly with the U.S., including Israel, are examples of all of this. For Saudi Arabia, they know that as the U.S. finds itself in a increasingly desperate situation, the U.S. is going to ask all of its, so-called allies to fall on their swords before the U.S. has to make any sacrifices. We see them doing that with Europe right now. They are paying the price for this conflict in Ukraine, not so much the U.S. They're doing the exact same thing in the Middle East. They're doing the same thing with Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has a choice: find an exit, or the U.S. is going to increasingly ask them to make these sacrifices at their own expense for foreign policy objectives that only benefit the United States, not Saudi Arabia. So China is an off-ramp, an exit, so to speak. Russia, multipolarism in general, is a much better long-term arrangement for Saudi Arabia. And it's not going to be pretty, because we see what the U.S. does to nations that try to pursue independent foreign policy. Germany, for example, they literally, okay, we don't know 100% for sure, but they literally blew up a pipeline, the Nord Stream pipelines, actually plural. They literally blew those pipelines up to keep Germany and the rest of Europe subordinated to the U.S. How far will they go in regards to Saudi Arabia making that? Because the point is, make an example out of them, because if they get away, everyone else is going to follow.
Yeah.
They're trying to prevent a stampede to the exit. So each time they need to make an example, it will become more and more extreme. And there's a lot of parallels to organized crime and how they operate. I think organized crime, like say in a neighborhood, is a microcosm of how the U.S. international order actually operates. It's very much like an organized crime.
That's right. As a coincidence, I saw yesterday that the US has dropped all charges against MBS, and this was coincidentally at the time when President Xi landed in Saudi Arabia. And you can see the US is trying everything they can. However, if they can drop the charges now, they could have dropped it at any point, or even why start the charges? And it just goes to show, the US is never about. They don't really care about Khashoggi. They don't care about his wife. They don't care about who's murdered where. They only care about their own interests. And the fact that they can drop it instantly during President Xi's arrival in Saudi just goes to show what they really think. It's an absolute insult to Khashoggi and his wife. I mean, why start in the first place if you're going to drop it? At this point, if you're going to do something, just take it to the end. And like I said, I'm quite scared of Saudi Arabia, and obviously you're 100% right. Saudi Arabia has been in a chokehold ever since they planned a Saudi Arabian invasion back in the day when Saudi Arabia and other countries, Middle Eastern countries, did an oil embargo against the United States. And the United States oil, petrol prices went through the roof. It was causing all sorts of havoc, and they were drawing up plans to invade Saudi Arabia at the time. And if Saudi Arabia didn't stop this embargo, you can guarantee US would have gone into Saudi Arabia and taken control of the oil fields. So since then, obviously, they've gone into Saudi Arabia and said, with a chokehold, you guys need to agree to this petrodollar or else. And they obviously didn't have a choice. At the time, US was the strongest nation on earth. And, you know, but the times are different now. Now you have the rise of China, pretty much Russia as well. Times are different. You can have a multipolar world where you have multiple superpowers um, in the world. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you would never see that because the US was the sole superpower the world has ever seen and the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. But now with the rise of China, countries have a choice. And I think that's one of the things that Saudi Arabia is kind of weighing up, whether if they do decide to get away from the petrodollar, then they can maybe arrange some sort of a defense treaty with China and Russia at the same time to protect Saudi Arabia like the US did. I'm sure all of these talks are going on behind the scenes, and why not? I mean, you can see Russia the way they've protected, Syria, and why not if they kind of agree to this deal? Why not Chinese bases and Russian bases, protecting Saudi Arabia at the same time? And if Saudi Arabia joins BRICS, for example, and in the future they might join the SCO, there could be some sort of joint defense treaty amongst those countries as well. So there are options now. 10, 20 years ago, there was definitely no option. And during the time when, US kind of decided to turn on Saddam, they decided to turn on Gaddafi. You have to understand that time there was no China, rise of China at the time. The US was the sole superpower. They can pretty much do whatever they want. So the fact that they wanted to go along their own path, and you've seen what's happened to them. But yeah, I'm still scared of Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's obviously they might not be able to invade Saudi Arabia, but there's always a possibility of color revolutions. There's always a possibility of US going into Saudi Arabian oil fields and taking over the oil fields, like they've done in Syria. So there's a lot of options that the US has got. However, those options seem to be limited as the US gets weaker and China gets stronger. Those options are getting limited by the day. What's your thoughts on everything I've said?
You're bringing up an awful lot of good points. I mean, a whole bunch of good points, and I'm trying to think of where to start. Really, I would say so. If we use the hostage analogy, let's use it maybe stretching it a little bit here. If they're in a headlock and the U.S. has a gun in their rib cage, threatening to shoot them, and there's a pile of other hostages dead that the U.S. has already shot. They're pretty sure they're going to be the next one shot in this hostage situation. But if they have a chance to wrestle themselves free and run to where the rest of the multipolar world is for safety, there's a chance they might get shot in the back as they're running. But it's a better chance than staying with the U.S. because almost certainly the U.S. as it declines, whichever allies, nations that it has leverage over, they are going to use them and bleed them first before the U.S. starts taking any detriment to itself. So that's the choice Saudi Arabia has, and it like you're saying, there's all kinds of options the U.S. could exercise over proxy. And these are all things that Saudi Arabia is going to have to figure out and defend against. Now, what's interesting is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I'm pretty sure it was the SCO.
Yeah.
They were talking about specifically a joint action against Western-style color revolutions. We already got a little preview of what this might look like. Russia going into Kazakhstan and helping stabilize the country in the middle of what was obviously a U.S.-sponsored, not an uprising, but instability, destabilization. And so if the SCO really got together, organized against this, I think it would be a very effective way to protect everyone in the SCO and anyone who went to the SCO for protection. And like, say, here in Thailand, for example, where I'm based, the U.S. puts huge pressure on Thailand, and they have a whole array of nasty things that they can do to increase the pressure. There's this violence in the Deep South that the U.S. is obviously involved in. there are these street mobs that the U.S. is sponsoring and supporting and encouraging. And there has been terrorism connected to groups that the U.S. has been involved in, like bombings in Bangkok. So all of these things Thailand faces. They also face the prospect of economic damage that the U.S. could do, because Thailand depends on the U.S. as a major export partner. Not its biggest, but a significant one. I think they would like to maintain. China is their largest export partner and obviously import partner. So if the SCO could come up with a way to protect nations against this coercion, these threats, the hybrid warfare the U.S. wields against other nations, if there was a way to protect themselves against that, I think that would significantly accelerate the process of multipolarism, and it would give countries like Saudi Arabia more confidence in doing it, and it would make it a smoother process rather than having to suffer through years of destructive internal conflict sponsored by the U.S. That does damage. I mean, that could set a country back years and years. But if they don't go through that and they remain subordinated to the U.S., they're going to be bled in other ways. So I guess it's, this is something that the SCO, China, Russia, they have the capability of doing this. They do it within their own boundaries. They have the means to give other countries these capabilities. Just for an example, I always talk about information space and how it's a domain that a nation has to protect, just like its airspace, land borders, and shores. Information space in the 21st century is critical to protect. You cannot have US-based social media companies dominating your information space, because it's common knowledge now that the US State Department works with these companies. They are influencing people in your country, turning them against you, dividing them against each other. Just like if they had troops in your streets or gunboats off your shore shelling, they do real world damage this way. China and Russia have IT capabilities. They have their own social media platforms that they use domestically. These are platforms that could be not extended over into countries, but they can work with software engineers in, say, a country like Thailand and help them develop their own indigenous social media platforms and slowly squeeze Facebook, Twitter, YouTube out, just like China has done, just like Russia is doing. So that's just one example. And that's how you really throw cold water on these color revolutions, because that is one of the key ingredients that they use to keep them going, to poison people's minds slowly but surely. And also, Russia and China have a growing media presence worldwide. And if we start talking about these topics more and more, and more people understand what a color revolution is, why it's wrong for one country to interfere in the internal political affairs of another, that will free the hands of governments like in Thailand to really deal with these networks that are involved in this. Because if they did it now, the Western media, they still dominate a lot of the news people see and read and listen to. They're going to say, oh, look, Thailand, it's a dictatorship. They're suppressing free speech, when in reality, they're trying to stop these people funded by the US from burning their country down. So there's a lot of things that can be done here. And I hope that the SCO, I mean, when they talked about counter color revolution, I hope it's things like this, along these lines. You had a lot of questions, so maybe I forgot. So if I missed anything, let me know.
No, I think you've answered most of it. I wanted to stick to the Middle East. And over the years, when I was growing up, I always used to see a lot of articles on The Guardian, and even kind of US articles, how the attack on Iran is imminent. And I was always thought that would be the next war in the Middle East. I mean, obviously, US has been moving the goalposts. First, it was Iraq, then Afghanistan, then there's other countries, Libya and Yugoslavia. And it seems like Iran has pretty much got away with it. And right now, I mean, I don't know if you watched the World Cup, but the World Cup has been an absolute eye-opener for Qataris, especially. Here you have Qatar, who has been very subservient to the US. They've got a huge military base in Qatar. They've been launching attacks into Afghanistan, into Iraq from Qatar bases. When they run away from Afghanistan, they obviously landed in Qatar. Qatar's been very good to the West. It's been very open. And one thing that Qatar didn't do is sell its gas deals to the Europeans, and that's one thing they did not do. And then the World Cup started, and you start seeing stories about human rights issues in Qatar, and it's completely blown over proportion. And the Qataris were pretty much shocked. And if you watch a World Cup, you'll realize when you see a World Cup match, you will see advertisements on the sides, and all of those advertisements are Qatari companies. There's no Western companies there. You're not going to see major US brands or British brands advertising in Qatar. And I think Qataris have been absolutely shocked by this. A day after the World Cup opened, they signed a deal with China, going up to for 27 years, I believe. And they said, you know what, screw this, screw the West. We're just going to sign this deal with China. And I think the whole of Middle East is now just looking, you can be friends with the US, but when you really need the US to be at your side, all they do is fire these human rights abuses and all of these other ridiculous abuse claims and stuff. And the Qataris have woken up, and the rest of Middle East have also woken up as well. And I think you will see a big change in US policy coming out of the US from the Middle East, and obviously starting with Saudi Arabia, and I think all of the other Middle East countries will follow. So if Saudi Arabia decides to end the petrodollar, you can guarantee the rest of the countries, including Qatar, will start following. UAE as well. UAE pretty much follow what Saudi do anyway. You can see a big change and shift happening in the Middle East, and this is just going to accelerate the end of the petrodollar. And I just don't know what the US would do if this happens, really. I mean, this could be huge problems back in the US, because if countries stop using the petrodollar, the dollar would literally crash. There's going to be hyperinflation. Nobody would be able to afford anything in the US. There'll be riots in the streets. And, US might not have any choice but to go into these, Middle Eastern countries and take over their oil. I mean, what's your thoughts?
I don't know what would happen, but I think you're bringing up a really good point about Qatar and the World Cup and how, they finally became, they have been cooperating with the West extensively, and now they're the target of all of these types of abuses and coercion that the West uses on everyone else. And again, it goes back to your personal experience, your interpersonal relations with others. When you see someone who is abusive and disrespectful and just an unpleasant person toward others, how long until you end up being a victim of that type of behavior? It's only a matter of time. And the same goes for the United States. That is how the United States does business. That's how they do business. And if eventually there's going to be some sort of juncture where you and the United States are not on the same page, and they are going to do these things to you to get you on the same page with them, even if it's completely at your own expense. I just saw that chat up on the screen about a big push around the world to kick NGOs like the NED and its ilk out. Yeah, I mean, people are becoming increasingly aware of how the color revolution method works. Nations are well aware of this. Thailand, the government here is very well aware of this. It's a quandary, though. If they kick them out, the U.S. is going to turn the screws tight on Thailand. They don't want that. So they have to do a very careful balancing act between managing the damage that these organizations do. It's not the NED directly. It's the fake NGOs that they fund that are doing all of this damage. They have to find a way to manage them without going overboard and giving the U.S. an excuse to tighten the screws tighter. So this is, again, and many nations are playing this balancing act. It's not because they are in league with the special interests in the U.S. It's that they really don't have a choice. They don't know a graceful way to get out of this situation where their sovereignty is being attacked and undermined. And if they come out too strong against it, it'll just open up the possibilities for the U.S. to apply pressure in much more direct and more damaging ways. So hopefully, the reason why we see the NED-funded organizations being thrown out of everywhere is because collectively nations recognize this as a threat. They're backing each other up and helping rid their country and their region of this very insidious interference. It's interference in complete violation of international law, of the UN Charter, a violation of political independence that's guaranteed to every nation under the UN Charter. It should not be tolerated. It's only tolerated because in this world, might makes right, and there's an overabundance, or there had been an overabundance of might consolidated by the Americans. So maybe that's changing, and people have the opportunity to kick them out, and they are. And I think we'll continue to see more of that. And we'll also continue to see the United States trying to reassert itself in opposition to this general movement of, sliding out from under the shadow of U.S. hegemony.
Thanks for that, Brian. And I'm going to finally move on to the last question, and we're going to move to the Southeast Asia. And I know everyone knows that you live in Thailand, so it's going to be very much an ASEAN-based question. One of the news articles that's not been talked about in the West, and you have to really look deeply to find news articles such as this, but Vietnam has recently agreed for a high-speed rail link to go from China all the way to its capital. And they're going to be using Chinese lines. So this means, these trains would go from Chinese cities like Kunming, for example, go all the way to Vietnam. And they're also going to be going to Laos, Cambodia. And there's going to be very much a high-speed rail network all across Southeast Asia. There's high-speed rail lines linking Thailand to Laos as well being made. And the only stick in the mud I can see is Malaysia. Malaysia is the only country which has not, which did agree to high-speed rail lines, but they had a change of government, and the new government had cancelled them. And you have Indonesia, who have got Chinese high-speed rail links as well. So the only problem is Malaysia. And if Malaysia agrees to having a high-speed rail link, that means that trains will go all the way from Kunming all the way to Singapore, and potentially there could be some sort of tunnel or a bridge linking Singapore to Indonesia, for example, and that would link up all of Southeast Asia apart from Philippines. And what do you think about all of these infrastructure high-speed rail links linking up the Southeast Asian countries, and what do you think about Malaysia being the stick in the mud to all of this?
Well, I had just been covering exactly why Malaysia is being a big stick in the mud, because they have a National Endowment for Democracy sock puppet now as prime minister, and he has been trying to worm his way into power for decades, and he has been backed by the United States every step of the way. And every nation in Southeast Asia has a character like this. So in Malaysia, it's Anwar Ibrahim and his circle of opposition groups, and National Endowment for Democracy funded fake NGOs and organizations. ODYSEE is one of them. In Thailand, it's Thaksin Shinawatra and now Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit. They're both billionaires. They work together, and they're all backed by the United States. And their street mobs are supported by fake NGOs funded by the NED. In Myanmar, it's Aung San Suu Kyi. In Cambodia, it was the Cambodian National Rescue Party, something like that. And they were incredibly unsuccessful. And now they're based primarily where? In Washington, literally in Washington, D.C., just to show you how absolutely ridiculous in reality it is, and how they try their best to paper over how absurd it is, how the U.S. really is just trying to put puppets into power. That was what was going on in Cambodia. All of these nations are on the rise because of China's rise. That is a fact. And if it's not because of infrastructure, it's because of trade and technology that is spreading across the region because of China's rise. Virtually every country in the region, their largest trade partner, export and import partner, is China. Largest source of tourism across the region is China. More and more nations in Southeast Asia are buying weapons from China rather than the United States. Thailand is a big example of that. A lot of people still have it stuck in their mind that Thailand was an ally of the U.S., which it really wasn't. We go back to this hostage situation we were talking about with Saudi Arabia. It was very similar for Thailand during the Vietnam War. But since then, they've been pivoting slowly and now very quickly toward inward, I guess, toward Asia. They buy all of their main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles from China. They're buying submarines. Their first modern submarines will be from China, and other naval vessels from China. So I mean, it's just a lot. It is a huge pivot, and people not paying attention might not realize this. Vietnam, I'm glad you brought that up. It's very interesting. Vietnam, a lot of people think maybe they do have some history with China, and maybe things aren't 100% great now, but they still do a huge amount of business together, including infrastructure projects. So the high-speed rail in Vietnam, that's news to me, but I do know that China connected Vietnam to their I forget what it's exactly called, but it's a rail line that goes all the way from Vietnam all the way to Europe. So Vietnamese companies can export to Europe via this railway. It was, it's a leap forward for trade and economics in the region, and this is only possible because of China. The West had massive influence, primacy even. That's what the West, or the United States, considers primacy over Southeast Asia for decades, and they accomplished none of this over decades. And the amount that is being accomplished in such a short amount of time because of China's genuine investment and interest in raising the entire region, it is a complete contrast. I mean, it's so obvious. There's that link. There was also a metro project in one of Vietnam's largest cities that was also built by Chinese technology and companies. They came in and they built this metro system, the first metro system in that city. I don't remember which one it was. It was about a year or two ago this happened. Laos, I don't know if people realize this. It's landlocked, it's mountainous, and before China came in and built highways and then now a high-speed rail line, they just had these winding, tiny roads going through the mountains. It would take you 3 days to go from Kunming, which is in southern China, 3 days to go from Kunming through Laos to Vientiane, the capital of Laos, which is right on the border of Thailand. I actually made that trip one time by bus, and it was horrible. I mean, it was not pleasant. And if you had to do that for business, it just makes things so much more difficult. When they built the highway, and they were building the highway when I wasn't finished yet, unfortunately. But when they finished it, it took that trip from 3 days and brought it down to 24 hours. Now they have a high-speed rail system going along the same route, and it cuts that down from 24 hours to just a couple of hours to go from Kunming to Vientiane. They're also right now building the high-speed rail link through Thailand to this now completed line through Laos. And already the Thai government, and again, it goes back to these US-backed opposition figures, this billionaire, Thanaton, has openly said, we need to cancel the high-speed rail with China and build Hyperloop that does not even exist. It doesn't exist. Which, if you translate that into realistic terms, it means cancel infrastructure projects with China, and it's just better to have no infrastructure at all if it means working with China. And again, it's because he is backed by the US, and he is serving US interests at the cost of Thailand's best interests. That project is under construction. It has been significantly delayed for a wide range of reasons. Hopefully, now we see it's successful in Laos. Maybe they will speed it up here in Thailand. But the Thai government is already looking into ways to, because the Mekong River separates Laos and Thailand, building bridges and building logistic hubs there to take advantage of now this high-speed rail system that exists and moves people and freight back and forth, where it used to be almost impossible to move goods and people. So this is what China is doing for the region. The US is opposed to this. They're not opposed to it in the sense of we have a better alternative. They're opposed to it in the sense of we don't want any of this development to happen. We want you to remain undeveloped, cheap labor, cheap resources that we can exploit. And we don't want to see this rise in living standards, in infrastructure and development. We certainly don't want to see this region getting a formidable military that can defend itself. We don't want to see any of that. And that is at the root of U.S. foreign policy for Southeast Asia. And again, countries here have to kind of go along with it to a certain extent, because if they don't, then the U.S. will become more forceful and they will do damage. They have done significant damage to every country. Myanmar right now, because the military in Myanmar ousted Aung San Suu Kyi. She had been in power for a while, and she was trying to, reverse things. She had literal Australian and British citizens as advisors, helping her, rewrite economic policy, the constitution, the legal system, recolonizing Myanmar. The military ousted her, and the U.S. is now backing this opposition, the National Unity Government and the People's Defense Force, which are just terrorists trying to burn the country down. That's what's going on in Myanmar. And now Anwar Ibrahim is Prime Minister of Malaysia. He had already been in the process of obstructing infrastructure projects with China. And there's no reason to believe that he's not going to continue doing that now that he's Prime Minister. He got in by a very slim margin. So hopefully there will be significant opposition to everything he does, and he'll be gone before too long. That's the hope. Countries deserve to be sovereign. Freedom, the democracy, all of this all depends entirely on your sovereignty. And if another nation is dictating what happens within your borders, you cannot have freedom, cannot have democracy, you cannot have human rights, because you have no sovereignty. It all comes down to sovereignty. Angelo Giuliano comes on my channel every Friday. This is a point he always makes, and he's 100% right. So these are the battle lines here in Southeast Asia. And we could talk quite a bit about this. The South China Sea, several Southeast Asian nations have claims in the South China Sea, but they also have claims against each other, and they get quite heated. And you will see Indonesia or Malaysia. I don't know which country is doing it. I think they all do it. They'll seize fishing boats. There's nobody on them, but they'll very dramatically blow them up to because you're in our waters that we claim, and vice versa. So it's not just China creating a problem with Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has problems with each other, but it's always resolved bilaterally. It could get heated, but it never interferes in bilateral ties and trade, because peace, stability, prosperity, this is what's of primary concern for everyone in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Brian. I just want to say that I'm really happy to see Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other countries around Southeast Asia rise again, because these countries have been the most bombed countries during the Vietnam War. And I believe maybe around 20-30% of the country is still unoccupied, because there's still hundreds and thousands of unexploded bombs still in those countries. They're still demining it as of today. And
Yes.
the US has not given them any money for completely demining or cleaning up their mess, basically, that they're left behind. So these countries had to kind of do it themselves. US has given small aid here and there, but that's not going to do much. And I'm really happy that these countries are now starting to rise up again, building the infrastructure, connecting to each other. And this is going to be obviously the new multipolar world, and this is going to be, as Europeans continent kind of goes down, deindustrializes, that part of the world is starting to industrialize to a really big extent. And I believe the US is very scared of that, because they're going to lose their influence along that part of the world. And my other question to you, Brian, is, when Obama was in power, he was talking about the pivot to Asia. Has this pivot to Asia failed? Because everything that's happened since then to now, it seems like America is losing its touch or its grip in reality, because they've gone to these Southeast Asian countries, they've gone to Vietnam, and there's a famous picture of that young lady who's the vice president going to the guy who was bombing I think it's some sort of funeral. I think some sort of funeral of going to some sort of guy who has been bombing Vietnam, and she was like laying the roses next to his grave.
Kamala
And
Harris.
yeah, the Kamala Harris. Yeah, I couldn't remember her name for some reason. Yeah, and yeah, she was
No
laying,
worries.
she completely insulting the Vietnamese. I mean, this guy was bombing the Vietnamese, and she's going in there to lay, flowers next to them, and she's going to Singapore, and she's talking about anti-Chinese stuff to Singapore, and she doesn't realize half of Singapore are Chinese, and
And speak Chinese.
and speak Chinese, and they're doing all of these things just to kind of alienate themselves even more. And I think this pivot to Asia thing has completely failed. And the biggest insult is recently they went to this ASEAN summit, and the US agreed to give them like a really small kind of amount, like millions of dollars for what? For aid. And we're talking about very small amount, like literally millions of aid. I mean, what is that going to do? I mean, they make more with China with trade, in a minute compared to what US has given them for aid, and that was the kind of the biggest insult. And I think all the ASEAN countries have realized, you know what, we don't need the US anymore. And what's your thoughts?
Well, first about demining in Southeast Asia, all of these countries, the U.S. just carpeted with bombs and mines and all kinds of things, ordnance of all kinds. They actually do provide money to do demining, but it's such a tiny amount that at the rate they're demining, it'll be hundreds of years before it's safe to walk in any of these places. So it's essentially as good as nothing. And I remember some representative for a U.S. representative to ASEAN claiming, "Oh, we've doubled it." And when you did the math, I mean, it was still nothing. So you double zero, you still have zero, right? And this is something they were touting as, our commitment to Southeast Asia. We're really great partners. You bombed them. These are your bombs. These are your mines. It's your responsibility to clean them up. And then you're claiming you're doing everyone a big favor by doing it. That's what you're going to put on the list of things you have to offer Southeast Asia, and people can see through it. And the only way they make progress in this region is by removing people with common sense from power, overthrowing their governments, and putting these client regimes in their place who are hopelessly detached from reality, just like Zelensky. We were talking about Zelensky, his ego, and how it doesn't dawn on him that he is not some exception to the rule. He is going to be another client regime that buries his country and dismantles it brick by brick. And it's the same in Southeast Asia. So the pivot to Asia, announced under the presidency of Barack Obama and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, at the time, I was warning people that this was not some sort of commitment the U.S. was making to Southeast Asia. This was them reinvesting and refocusing on regime change, dividing, destroying the region, putting client regimes into power, and then pivoting the whole region against China, exactly how the U.S. has done with Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe just full of basket cases and nearly failed states, and putting client regimes into power with this irrational hatred towards Russia, and using them as proxies against Russia at their own expense, the expense of those countries transformed into proxies. The pivot to Asia was to do that to Southeast Asia. And the way they were doing it, and the reason why it's somewhat unsuccessful, is because they have been failing to get their clients into power in each one of these countries. Aung San Suu Kyi was removed from power, and where Ibrahim is in power, you have this opposition the U.S. is backing here in Thailand that could potentially get into power in the next election. Hard to know, but also hard to tell how much they'll get done and how long they'll be in power after that. But yeah, that's pretty much the way the lines have been drawn. And you're asking, has it been a failure? I think it's hard to tell until everything is done. Right now, I would not rest easy and say, yes, the U.S. has failed in Southeast Asia. I think now more than ever, people need to be vigilant. They need to invest heavily in their national sovereignty and security, and also regional security, because the U.S. is not done. They're not going to give up on this. Anwar Ibrahim getting into power in Malaysia is an example of not only a success, but the fact that they are still heavily invested in this process here in Southeast Asia. They invest more and more in media. They're infiltrating education across the region. And so this is going to be a problem, a constant problem that the region has until the U.S. Declines to an extent where it can no longer do this, or until the region grows strong enough where this type of interference has no impact or influence. You were talking about Kamala Harris, yeah, going to Singapore, and I believe that the government in Singapore had to either tell her, or not tell her directly, but just simply state, we're not picking sides here. We want to have a positive relationship with everybody. Please don't come here and try to recruit us into some sort of anti-China crusade, because we're not interested. And this is pretty much the message from every nation with a sovereign government in the region. Now, of course, you get, actually, even Aung San Suu Kyi, even though she was a complete U.S. proxy and depended entirely on Washington, even she had to be careful, because at the time, and still to this day, Myanmar is almost entirely dependent on Russia and China. So it would have taken time for her to pivot Myanmar away from China without the whole economy collapsing. That's the point. China is creating relationships based on tangible things, and the U.S. does it through this political meddling. One is much more resilient than the other. One kind of aggregates as you go along. The other, you have to constantly invest in it to keep it going. You know what I mean?
That's right, yeah. And I've read some articles saying all of these Southeast Asian countries always used to say that whenever China comes to a Southeast Asian country, they always talk about trade, infrastructure, links, and how to have win-win situations. But when the US comes in, the first thing they talk about is how to be anti-Chinese. And that's all they want. They just want anti-Chinese. They want military bases, and that's all they talk about. They don't talk about anything about infrastructure or win-win trades or anything like that. So that brings me to the end of the show, Brian. I really appreciate you coming on and taking your time to chat with us. Really, appreciate what you've done, and I hope you can carry on doing what you're doing best. The world needs you. And thanks for everyone who's joined in and listened to our podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It's really important to grow the channel. I'm still new in this YouTube world, so your support, makes all the difference. And thanks, Brian. I hope you can come again and chat to us. And over to you. Any last words?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed talking with you, and also Alex before you had to leave. I also really enjoyed. I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat also, as you have a lot of really intelligent people in there having really interesting conversations related to what we were talking about. So I really did enjoy this, and I will definitely be back in the future. So thank you again.
Thanks, Brian. So okay, I'm going to leave it there, and I really appreciate everyone that's come on so far, and thanks to all the moderators out there. Thanks for everyone that's listening, and again, thank you, Brian, and I hope to see you soon. Take care for now.